do. So, for instance, I've been interested lately in, as Paras knows about tree water use, and we don't have any tree physiologists on this campus. So, so it is nice to be so close to Boulder, just because they have social scientists and things that we don't have quite so many. So.
So Tanvi, when the time next, please let us know.
Sir, I think there is some still lag from IT group. So there is a breakage in getting live. So they are fixing it. It may take like 2-3 more minutes.
No
Okay.
problem.
Nimita, good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Ajay has joined. So.
Yes, sir, we are live now. So.
Okay. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Tanvi, it's so nice to finally see your face after all these emails. It's really nice to finally meet you.
At a point of time, I was getting scared that you may be pissed off from my exchange of emails.
No, not at all.
Today morning itself, I sent you a reminder, okay, we are on. So
I appreciate it, especially with the time zones. You never know. I messed up a talk 6 months ago in China because of the dateline, and so I did not show up. And so the whole group of people was waiting for me because it was a different day, right? Which this is much easier, and I didn't even know. So it's always good to have reminders. So.
Yes, so that was the only worry, but I was very much sure that you will be much before us, so it's fine. So we are already online on the YouTube. So the sir. So we can start, yes.
Okay. So let me formally start, though we had a quick chat with our very distinguished speaker today, Professor Kamini Singha. Very good morning to Kamini and good evening to all colleagues in India. This talk is especially designed for the exploration scientists, those who are using the geophysical tool to understand near subsurface for several purposes, and one of the important purpose is to know how critical zone behaves in response to the different stresses and other climate changes, and can we detect the signature of those changes using the geophysical technologies. And there cannot be a better person than Professor Kamini Sinha to be with us today, who had the very wide range of expertises, right from imaging near surface to the modeling, the fluid flow interaction of water with the near surface sediments, and so on. We are very pleased and honored, and in fact, we are very grateful that she could spare time in so early morning for delivering lecture today and connecting with us on an important topic, which in India we had started very recently, though it appears to be late, but in India also the topic is catching very fast. There are several programs launched in the country, and fortunately we have with us today those who had been the architects of initiating the critical zone studies in India. Dr. R.N. Singh, Dr. Ashok Singhvi, and our several other research council members of CSIR-NGRI. So, Professor Singh, you might be knowing, and with this brief welcome, I invite the SCG office bearer at CSIR-NGRI, our colleague Nimisha Vedanti, to formally introduce Professor Kamini Singha. And you all may be aware that it's 2007 when a chapter of SCG started at CSIR-NGRI, and now we have a very vibrant SCG, SPG. SPG is Society of Petroleum Geophysicists, both combined chapter together, where a good number of researchers and students are actively involved in the activities of exploration geophysics and exploration geosciences in general. So it's over to you, Nimisha.
Thank you, sir. So I welcome Dr. Kamini Singha on behalf of SCG chapter at NGRI, and on behalf of our students who are doing PhD at NGRI, and of course all other colleagues. So our director has already given a wonderful introduction to her work, and we all already know that how useful this talk is going to be. I'll quickly run through her CV for the sake of new students, especially who may not be aware of the elaborate work that she has done. So to start with, Professor Kamini Singha was born in 1977 in New York. She is a professor in the Department of Geology and Geological Engineering at the Colorado School of Mines, and she is Associate Dean of Earth and Society Programs at CSM. She has attended University of Connecticut and graduated with geophysics with honors with a bachelor's degree in geophysics in 1999. From 1907 to 2000, she worked at the United States Geological Survey in the field of geophysics. But her basically her PhD degree was in hydrogeology, which she earned from Stanford University, which is the most prestigious university, one of the most prestigious university in US, in 2005. So from 2005 to 2012, she was an associate professor in the Department of Geosciences at Penn State University. During this time, she also serving as the chair of AGU, AGU chairman of AGU in hydrogeophysics branch, so which is again a respectable honor. In 2012, Professor Singha became an associate professor of geological engineering at the Colorado School of Mines, where she is working till now. And additionally, she served as associate director of the hydrologic science and engineering program from 2014 to 16, and continuing teaching at CSM. So if you go through her list of publications, she has more than 90 peer-reviewed publications, and which are highly cited. And her work speaks through her students also. Like more than 50 students she has guided until now in her career. And what all contributions are there, those already our director has discussed. So I'll go through the list of awards, what she has achieved in such a small career span. Dr. Singha is the recipient of an NSF Career Award, which was awarded by the Early Career Award Committee from the Society of Environmental and Engineering Geophysics in 2009. She also became the National Groundwater Association's Darcy Lecturer in 2017 and a GSA Fellow in 2018. She was chosen as Ben Freyer Endowed Professor for Innovation and Excellence in 2007 at Colorado School of Mines, and Fulbright Scholar Award from the Government of Ireland in 2019. So these things mostly will be available on her page, but there are some things which may not be available on her page. I would like to throw light on those activities also. So many people may not be knowing that she is very popular for her community outreach activities. And She has worked a lot with these community outreach programs. Since 2014, she has worked as a research mentor at Research Experiences in Solid Earth Sciences for students. And RESESS is an organization which is working to provide undergraduate students research opportunities and support specifically students from underrepresented groups in the geosciences. So that's how she is very popular in the students community. She has also started a program at CSM which is called as Mining for Talent program. And not many people may be knowing that she is one of the pioneers who started the SEG Women's Network. And that's why from SEG WNC, on behalf of that also, I invite you, and we are really waiting to hear you. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation. Thank you. Now it's over to you, Kamini.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you for the very kind introductions, and it's very nice to be here. Thank you all for staying late today at work. I'm going to share my slides, hopefully. All right, so hopefully you can see my slides. So thank you for spending a bit of your evening with me. I know that I am between you and dinner, so I will try to make this as entertaining as I can, given that that lofty goal. So today, as your director had mentioned, I am going to talk a bit about critical zone science and the use of geophysics. And I know that this group has an interest specifically in climate, so I will try to talk a bit about that too. So let me just get started. So for those of you, especially some of the students who might be new to this idea of critical zone science, you have a great team of critical zone scientists at your institutions. But the idea of the critical zone is that we're looking at that piece of the Earth from the base of groundwater to the top of the atmosphere. And we call it the critical zone because it's the part that we as humans interact with most. And so it's critical in some ways to our survival because it's where we get our food, where we get our water, where we put our waste. And this idea of critical zone science is now more than 15 years old. And the idea was to think about integrated science, so geology and atmospheric science and wireless sensor networks and human interactions and agriculture, all as one sort of integrated field. And there's some key processes that people have been thinking about for some time. And there was a really nice white paper that was published in 2017 by Pam Sullivan called New Opportunities in Critical Zone Science, where she tried to highlight, this was a group of early career researchers, highlight what was the important and pressing problems within critical zone science that they hoped people might look at. And so I'm going to talk about 5 of those processes today in brief, because I think there are things that geophysicists can do and answer around these topics, specifically the delivery of water or energy into the subsurface. So this idea of how we turn rock into soil, which has obviously big roles in agriculture, that link between vegetation and water, some of the controls on terrestrial carbon, and then lastly, changes with what a critical zone can provide in the face of disturbance. So that is the sort of areas I'm going to try to cover in brief today. And I'm going to show you what I can of some pretty new literature within the last 5 years on this topic. So one of the things I want to throw out to this audience, which is probably no surprise, is the idea of using geophysics as what I might call a macroscope. So we all know what a microscope is, but the idea of being able to see into the subsurface on these really big scales in a way that we normally can't. And so I think of geophysics as, minimally a better way to interpolate between our boreholes and our soil pits than anything else we have. But maybe in the best case scenario, it's a way for us to really look at the controls and the processes happening in the subsurface and open up hypotheses that we might be able to test with some other methods. An example of that would be these 2 papers here. They were both collected within the Boulder Creek Critical Zone Observatory, which is not too far from where I am here in the western US in Colorado. And what you're looking at are some seismic data. And one of the things that's quite interesting about these 2 sets of refraction data is on the left-hand side, you see no differences in the depth of regolith or the depth of broken up rock, which you can see by those low P wave velocities between the north and south facing slopes. Whereas in the other data set on the right, Kevin Beefus's work, you do see big differences between the north and south facing slopes. And so this might lend you to wonder why. And without boreholes or without, beyond soil pits, we might not have been able to see these differences over this, landscape scale where we can start to look at things on the sort of kilometer reach. And one of the hypotheses that these two papers put forward were the St. Clair paper, which I was a part of, was that maybe the reason we don't see big differences in regolith thickness has to do with the fracturing being related to the stress that aquifer feels. So the regional tectonic stress, whether an aquifer is being squished together or pulled apart, would control the fracturing within that system. The Beefus paper, meanwhile, puts forward some hypotheses that exist within the critical zone literature around aspect, where those of us in the northern hemisphere would potentially see more freeze-thaw on north-facing slopes, the pole-facing slope, and consequently might see more broken up material. And so that might be a reason why we see differences between north and south-facing slopes. So what I think is really cool about geophysics is it gives us this opportunity to see over a much bigger scale where we can start to ask questions about process in a way that maybe we couldn't get without these data. So back in 2015, I was asked to publish a paper, sort of a review paper for reviews of geophysics about geophysical imaging in the critical zone. So I pulled together this team of authors, and honestly, there wasn't a lot to publish on at that time. So the amount of geophysics that existed, critical zone geophysics in 2015, was very thin. So if you would like to see a paper that sort of talks about the very beginnings of critical zone geophysics, this is it. But honestly, a lot has happened since this time. And so what I would like to do today is talk about a lot of the really cool new work that has come out since this paper, which is both not that old and very old when we think about this field, which is a fairly young field. So if you talk to a room of critical zone scientists, what they would like are, say, macroscopic distributions of things like porosity, the bulk density of materials in the subsurface, the chemical or the mineralogical composition, the mineral surface area, distributions of roots, subsurface connectivity. And I put that in quotes because that idea of connectivity in itself is very hard to define. What does it mean to be connected? And that would be great if we could have all of these things everywhere over our landscape. But some of this is very difficult, especially at the field scale, and our lab scale measurements don't encompass that, realistic heterogeneity that we see in field systems. But I do think that geophysics can get at some of these, and so that's what I would like to talk about today. So I'm going to go back to these 5 issues and show you where I think geophysics can contribute. So let's start with this very first one, which is this delivery of water or energy into the subsurface. Now, the reason we care about these things is that how water gets into the ground controls a lot of ecosystem services, right? This controls our freshwater supply, our groundwater quality, our surface water quality. It provides regulation for floods and for climate. This is also how we start to think about controlling soils and soil retention, crop production. There are a lot of reasons why how water gets into the ground matters. What's nice about this also is that moisture is a pretty easy geophysical target. So it has a big change in electrical resistivity. It changes the dielectric permittivity, and it changes the seismic velocity. So right there are 3 geophysical methods: electrical resistivity, ground penetrating radar, and seismic, that might be sensitive to this migration of moisture into the subsurface. So to show you a data set that came out, this is from Wyoming, so southern Wyoming, the state just north of where I am in the US. One of the things we could think about is how geology controls water movement. What I like about this data set is they've taken some sort of static images. They're not looking at changes in time, and have tried to use these data to imply how geology would control the movement of water. So what I'm showing you here to start are some seismic data. They have this broken up material that they have used this 1500 meter per second line to sort of indicate where they think the rock is highly broken up, this sort of regolith material. And they compared that to some electrical resistivity data, where you see down at the bottom of the slope a bit more moisture than you see high on the slope, which you can probably tell a story for, right? And what they did is they took those two data sets together and combined them to try to think about where is here at the bottom, I'm not sure if my mouse shows up, but there's this unweathered bedrock, and then above that is a weathered bedrock, and then above that is this mogul regolith, this stuff that's moving and easy. And what they wanted to do with this data set is look at the controls on water movement, and that they think that they see sort of deep flow or could predict some deep flow as sort of primary pathways on this hill slope, given this sort of weathered rock. And in this particular system, they found that overland flow and sort of shallow soil flow, interflow were negligible. And they attributed what they saw hydrologically to what they were seeing in these geophysical data. So the idea of using geophysics to get at facies or sort of hydrofacies, I think is a cool, is one cool way to use geophysics. Now, I think there's limitations here. And one of the things I liked about this paper, which is now a little bit older, from Western Germany, is that it really thinks about the rock physics. So one of the big struggles is trying to get our geophysical properties that we measure into something hydrologic that we care about. So how do we turn seismic velocities into moisture? Or in this case, it's a pretty common practice to use electromagnetic induction, or EMI, to estimate soil water content. But what I liked about this paper is they realized that it's not just moisture that is controlling the conductivity that they're measuring from electromagnetic induction, but that fluid electrical conductivity and porosity also control that variability. So what they've done in this particular system is they have mapped moisture content over the landscape using point measurements to the best of their ability. And then they compare that to the electrical conductivity that they were measuring from their electromagnetic induction. And they also had a map of porosity made from cores. And so what they did is they took this composite data set to build relationships such that they could use these EMI data to estimate water content, but by controlling for the fact that there were these other properties that matter. It's very hard to use conductivity for things in the hydrologic sciences, in critical zone science, because it's sensitive to temperature, it's sensitive to fluids, it's sensitive to salinity. And I thought this was a nice paper that was trying to bridge those gaps and recognizing that variability was controlled by multiple things. A new paper that just came out at the end of this last year, I also really like in that it talks about quantifying water volumes directly. So it gets away from this problem of rock physics that we were just talking about. One of the few instruments that we have access to as geophysicists that actually measures the amount of water that is in the subsurface is nuclear magnetic resonance, or NMR, or neutron logs, but that has an active source. So this work by Daniela Rempe and a student is looking at a couple of different wells here. What you're looking at is depth and moisture content between their NMR data and their neutron logs. You'll notice they're offset from one another, but that's not the important part of this paper. The important part is that they see seasonal differences in moisture. So looking between summer times and spring times, what you see is that there's actually a difference in these data sets, regardless of whether you're looking at the NMR or the neutron log. They go down to sort of 6 or so meters. And below that, the differences are pretty similar. And so what was neat about this data set is they were able to estimate the volume of water that was in the subsurface and these depths of moisture content changes. It was one of the first, I think, the first paper to have done this. And then they attributed these changes to root water uptake. And so they said the reason they see these big changes down to these depths has to do with the rooting of trees in this particular system. And I'll get back to trees in a little bit, but I do think it's a very nice data set in terms of trying to figure out where we would expect to see changes and actually quantifying that directly rather than using geophysics as a proxy for moisture. Let's see. I'd also like to talk a little bit about some of my work in Alaska, just because this is a very different system, thinking about Arctic critical zones, which I know is probably fairly far from lots of parts of India, but certainly there's plenty of alpine mountainous regions in the north. And so what you're looking at here in this image, you might just be able to see it, is this sort of Arctic landscape, and there's this greenish line down the center of this image. So what this is you might call it a zeroth order stream. There's no cut bank and it's full of vegetation. but it's basically a stream-like feature on the Arctic landscape, and it's a super common feature to see on the northern slope of Alaska. They call these things water tracks. They're stream-like, but because they don't have a cut bank and because you can't see the water, it's a little bit of a different feature. This is a very messy weir that's in place here, trying to measure the flow off this landscape. But most of the biogeochemical cycling that we see in Alaska is happening within these water tracks. And so a question that people have is, what is the role of groundwater in these permafrost constrained environments? So these are some geophysical data, some electrical resistivity data that one of my PhD students, Emily Wojtek, collected. And what you can see is a series of lines going down that landscape I just showed you. And this is organized the way the picture is. Here's sort of the top coming down towards the weir, and the weir is right down here at the bottom. And what you see is a change in resistivity associated with that water track. We can actually see this conductive feature going up the landscape. That is the water track itself. And then here to the side in red is permafrost, actually, is frozen ground. And so we can see that that water track not only provides sort of an area of thaw, there's actually a secondary channel that was hard to see on the landscape over here. These very small black dots are a frost probe, which basically is just a piece of rebar that you shove into the ground until you hit ice. It makes a sort of thunk sound, and then you map the depth to ice with this frost probe. So these are the frost probe data. But one of the things I thought was really interesting about this data set is, especially down here at the lower part of the hill slope, the frost probe data and the geophysics don't match up that well. So I think what we're seeing down here is probably partial melt. So something that's not completely thawed. So it's solid enough that we still see it with the frost probe, but it's melted enough that it shows up in the geophysical data. And that provides a whole lot more room, that area of partial thaw, for biogeochemistry. The other thing she did was she collected some self-potential data. I think self-potential is a really exciting method. We're still struggling to understand what all we measure with self-potential, but it is sensitive to flow. It's the only geophysical measurement that's sensitive to flow, just like NMR is one of the only ones that's sensitive to the water molecule. So what this is a grid over this landscape. Each of these points is a self-potential measurement, so a measure of naturally occurring voltage with respect to a base electrode that's off-site. And we're measuring voltages as we walk along this landscape. There's no active source, you're just measuring what's naturally there. Now, what you see here in black is I'll call it the watershed boundary. It's really the water track boundary, and it's very subtle on this landscape. We measured this with ground-based LiDAR. But what you can see is that we're tracking basically what you might expect in terms of the directionality of groundwater flow within the system, where these highs are basically defined by the watershed boundary, are pretty close there too, and that we see flow going in from the watershed boundary down to that center part of the water track. There's some heterogeneity, obviously, within this data set that doesn't fit that perfectly, but that's also because SP is sensitive to upwelling and downwelling, which we don't have a way of capturing well within this 2D map here. But it is a pretty compelling data set to say, we know where the frozen ground is, we know where the water track is, and here's what we see in terms of directionality of flow within that system. So I do think this idea of self-potential, not just in Arctic environments, but in any environment, to look at flow is a really cool method. And then I'll bring up one other data set here before I move on, and that's this, the idea of using geophysics not just to map moisture or conservative tracers. There's been a lot of work on mapping the movement of salts, for instance. What I'm showing you here are some electrical resistivity tomograms since the application of fertilizer in a lab scale lysimeter. And these tomograms, let's see, here in red, there's a couple of little lines on these tomograms. Those indicate the bands where the fertilizer application occurred. So this is an unsaturated zone application. So there's also changes in moisture that are happening within this system. But the big changes in EC are likely from this conductive fertilizer that was put in place. So what you see over here on the left-hand side is concentration with drainage. You see bromide, the conservative tracer, here in red. And then you see nitrate, which is the fertilizer, which is non-conservative, right? It reacts here in blue. You see the actual measurements of concentration, and then what we see from the electrical resistivity data. So these authors used a moment analysis to explore the production of ions associated with nitrate production. And so what you're actually capturing here in these long tails, here in the geophysics and here in reality, is the transport of a reactive species that is producing conductivity as it moves. And so this is something I've been interested in for a long time, although I think the problem is hard, but is how to use geophysics to capture reactive transport processes. Some geochemical processes will be conductivity consuming, some will be conductivity producing. Can we constrain their dispersion and their mixing well enough that we might be able to use geophysics to constrain what transport processes, what reactions we think are seeing in these systems? It might be hard, but I think it's a really cool idea. So there's a lot of issues to think about in terms of water getting into the ground, in terms of testing a bunch of these sort of conceptual models we have of these systems. I think we can image flow paths seasonally, beyond seasonally with these sorts of data. And a big sticky problem is developing these rock physics relationships between geophysics and other key properties to estimate moisture content. So let's move forward and think about transformation of rock into soil. Now, the reason we care about weathered material is because that is what is prone to landslides. This is also what is needed in terms of thinking about landscape evolution. And of course, from an agricultural perspective, this is where we grow plants. And so a question that people ask within critical zone science is what drives the weathering in different systems? Is it physical? Is it chemical? What can we say about what is happening in the subsurface that would allude to what sort of weathering is happening? This is also a very good geophysical target because broken up material tends, especially with seismic, to be less dense than material that is less broken up, consolidated bedrock. So this paper came out a couple of years ago. It's work from Jordan Hayes, and she had collected some data here in California, and she was asking some questions at the site about whether weathering was controlled by physical or chemical weathering. So this is the previous Southern Sierra Critical Zone Observatory. So what you're seeing up here are three plots. The depth with bulk tau here, which is a measure of the depletion or the enrichment of soluble minerals, so a geochemical measure. Here's the volumetric strain, so a physical weathering measure. And here is porosity. So what she noticed from these borehole data is that you can see that porosity tracks pretty closely with the volumetric strain, but does not track closely with bulk tau. So that would imply that physical weathering is probably dominating the production of porosity, at least at this site. And that, her bulk tau, which is looking at all the sort of major rock forming elements, doesn't change much with depth. But shows a depletion that might explain, I think it was something like 20% of her change in porosity, and that the rest had to be explained by strain. So what she did is she used some rock physics models, so coming back to the trickiness of rock physics, and she estimated porosity from seismic refraction velocity. So here are her seismic refraction data. Here are her estimates of porosity using a rock physics relationship. And then she took those estimates of porosity and her map of weathering, and she tried to estimate here strain from these particular data and from her relationships that she built in the boreholes. And so she wondered if the strain data she was looking at indicated root wedging. Maybe it went too deep for it to be freeze-thaw processes. It opened the question as whether she was seeing an expansion of sheet silicates. So again, it's a little hard to say for sure with these geophysical data what she's seeing, but what's neat about it is she can open these really cool hypotheses about what might be controlling weathering within the system. Here's that science paper that I showed you a second ago from the Boulder Creek data set. I just showed you this star in an early slide. I'm going to show you the two data sets that went with it from the eastern part of the United States. So up here is the data from Colorado. Here's the data from the southeast of the US, and here's from the northeast. So what I'm showing you here is how topographic stress, or what we think, this is a data set I was a part of, how topographic stress influences bedrock weathering by modifying the fractures that are already in this space. Now, one of the things that we see is that here in Gordon Gulch, where we have low compressive stress. So this aquifer is not squished very much. We see that the weathering of rock tends to parallel the topography. But we see something really different in these two East Coast sites where there's a much higher compressive stress. So these aquifers are being squished much more strongly. And in that case, our compressive stress mirrors the topography, which is really interesting. But here's the most interesting part. These data over here are data. So these are seismic measurements in the most right-hand column. They know nothing of the left-hand or the middle column. The left-hand and middle columns are based on models. So there's a stress strain model that's being used here to predict failure potential, to predict the least compressive stress. And what's interesting is these data have no idea of the model, and you can see, and the model knows nothing of the data, that we're able to predict generally what we think is happening in terms of weathering based on the stress in these particular watersheds. So that idea is really compelling. Can we then talk about where we would expect to see permeable materials in watersheds just by knowing something about the strain on that watershed? So that idea is really compelling. Whether this holds broadly is still an open question. Some other data that we have looked at in the Boulder Creek Critical Zone Observatory has been looking at seismic anisotropy. So rather than just sort of seismic data along lines, we're doing seismic data in either what are known as circle shoots or in rose diagrams where we rotate a line. And one of the things that we see is that we see, going back to this question of north and south facing differences within some of these watersheds, that in our short lines between our north and our south facing slopes, where we think we're primarily looking at soil, we see that our seismic data are isotropic, right? We don't see any differences with direction. This is a 360-degree view here. These are multiple seismic lines being put into a rose diagram. We see about 500 meters per second as the velocity on both hill slopes. But as we get deeper, we see something different. So on the north-facing side, where we might expect material to be more broken up, we see less pronounced anisotropy. It's still fairly isotropic. We're seeing velocities that are somewhat higher. But on the south-facing slope, we still have pretty strong anisotropy in place and somewhat higher velocities. So that it made us think about what might be happening within the system. We compared these data to some optical televiewer data where we could map fracture orientations. And one of the things that we see is there are more boreholes on the south-facing slope than the north, but generally the strike and dip of the fracture or the aspect of these fractures looks really similar from one hill slope to the other. So we don't see big differences in the orientation of these fractures. But what we think we're seeing is the role of foliation then on weathering. So here is a tomographic data set across these hill slopes again. In the percentage values here are the percent of anisotropy we see in these data. And what we see is much more anisotropic data on these south-facing slopes, which I showed you in that last slide. And we wonder if it's that way because of the alignment of foliation with topography. So if I take the data that we were seeing from those optical televiewer data and try to put it on this tomographic data, so these white lines are my best attempt at indicating fracturing within that landscape. One of the things we wonder if we're seeing is that because of the orientation of the fracturing against the south-facing slope, it's just easier for water to get in to this particular area and do work and weather this material. Whereas here in the north-facing slope, these fractures are shunting water off back towards the sort of lower part of the watershed. And so does foliation matter? And can we see that in our geophysics to give us some indication of weathering? So there's plenty to think about here too, in terms of what is driving weathering, these controls of regional stress that I was talking about, the potential for freeze-thaw processes where that is occurring. And is it possible that physical and chemical heterogeneity have different signals that we might be able to parse with some constrained data and some geophysics? And then, of course, what is the role of trees in breaking up material, which is going to bring us to this next piece, which is looking at these links between vegetation and hydrology. So geophysics is primarily been used to look at moisture content, as I talked about before, but I think there's a lot of interesting questions right now about what trees or plants do to the hydrobiogeochemistry of the subsurface. We know that different plants, what's happening in their roots is exciting and interesting and difficult to quantify. Is there something we can do with geophysics that might give us some information on that? What we know, this is a paper from Poland. What we know is that trees do add complexity, not surprisingly. So what these are, some electrical resistivity data under a living tree, under a dead tree. This matters to me less over here. I'm not going to talk about this pit and mound structure as much. But what you see is under the living tree, there's much more complexity than there is under this living tree. So not surprisingly, it's more complex because roots add a whole lot of complexity to that soil and regolith profile through root channels and moisture migration. They can form this pit and mound topography here. And then when the trees die off, we see less of that heterogeneity in the subsurface. This was several decades after the trees were taken down. And so we know that trees make things complex. But I think what's interesting is to think about process. Now, this is an older paper, but I'm showing it because it's one of my favorites. This is a paper by Jai Wickrame that came out of Michigan State, where he was looking at some rooting depths across a pretty sharp ecotone. So at 2 different times of year, they were looking at moisture. You notice this is a map of moisture, but it's really just an electrical resistivity line that's been converted with rock physics underneath a forest versus a landscape. And what you see is that it is drier, deeper underneath trees than it is underneath grasslands. This is not surprising. Trees use much more water per day than grasses. In this case, they may use many hundreds of liters of water a day. And over here, what they've done is they've taken these 2 data sets. They've looked at the change in moisture between May and August. So at the beginning of the growing season, at the end of the growing season with depth. And you see bigger changes deeper in the forested landscape, down to say 3.5 meters in the forested landscape, and only about 0.5 meter in the grassland. I think what's really cool about this data is they didn't think about it this way. They used these data to parameterize roots in a model so that they know how deep they went. But to me, I think it's very hard for us to image roots with geophysics. They're just, especially the fine roots, which do most of the work. But maybe what we can image is the idea of the active root zone, right? So we can see where they are actively doing work, and maybe that's good enough for some of the models that we're using. And so I like this paper because it really shows this idea of sort of this active rooting depth where things matter. So since that time, there has been a lot of work looking at vegetation and impacts, and we've been spending a lot of time thinking about diel cycling, so how things change on a daily basis. And we know that vegetation affects all sorts of subsurface water stores. When they're near streams, we see variations in stream water. Here's some very old data looking at changes in groundwater associated with vegetation use. Here's another data set from Wageningen in the Netherlands, right, where we can see these big differences in groundwater levels in forests and how we see much less in corn. So this idea of variable cycling tells us something about how trees are pulling moisture, how evapotranspiration is changing subsurface stores. And that data might be able to tell us something about what our aquifer systems look like. So we've been doing some work. This paper just came out. This is work of Ryan Harmon, one of my PhD students. I know this is kind of a busy plot, so apologies for that. But what we've been trying to figure out is, does that timing that we're seeing, those diel cycles between what we see happening inside of a tree and what's happening in the subsurface, tell us something about process? So in this upper plot right here, there's a couple of data sets. You can see rainfall over some summer months. We see the electrical conductivity here in red of a tree. So we're doing geophysics on trees at this point. So I'm showing you how the tree conductivity changes based on electrical resistivity. And here's the volumetric moisture content in the subsurface at 20 centimeters. And one of the things that we see is a pretty strong and inverted relationship between these two as the soils start to dry out. Right? The tree becomes more conductive and the soils start to dry out. Now, what drives the conductivity of trees? Well, one thing is moisture, right? And another thing could be nutrient uptake, although it's a little unclear exactly how much that would change, sort of long-term conductivities. I think there's great questions around that, but it's very hard to measure the chemistry of xylem waters. Most trees hold that under such high tension that it's difficult to extract those waters. But one of the things we did was some wavelet analysis. And we looked at the lag times. So if we just go back to those diel cycles, what are the lag times between that subsurface moisture and the in-tree electrical conductivity? And this map down here, this plot, estimates the lag, so how offset those two diel data sets are. And basically, there's no offset at early time in the system, basically 0 hours. But then it increases through July as things start to dry out to about 5 hours. And so we wondered if these data are caused by the limits of sort of root water uptake, that these trees just can't uptake more water, and it leads to this offset in the moisture seen in the tree versus the moisture in the soils. And these maps here of wavelet work, which is kind of a lot going on, but the important part here is what's highlighted in yellow, show you the strong correlations between sapwood electrical conductivity and soil moisture and the period associated with that. And what we see is that that correlation increases as the lags increase in time during those dry periods. And so it opens up some questions for us. Does soil moisture and internal water, does the link between them strengthen during prolonged drought? Now, you might expect that as soils dry, the ability to replenish internal water stores in the tree might decrease and then weaken that relationship instead. But in this case, we wonder if it's the opposite because we're working in a ponderosa pine forest. And ponderosa pines are known to have a deep rooting strategy where they actually will start taking water from deeper water stores, from groundwater, when shallow stores start to dry up. And so we're wondering if that's what we're seeing. Are we seeing our trees actually changing water source? And that's why these correlations tend to strengthen. Lots of questions here still to be answered, but again, the idea of geophysics is helping to open hypotheses. We've also been trying to model, what happens in the subsurface with in and around trees. These are some of the work of Emily Wojtek, a former PhD student of mine, where she was looking at changes in rainfall and sap flow within trees. She had some measured data on moisture content, on the subsurface matrix potential, and here's self potential again, that method that I think is so cool in terms of measuring directionality of flow. And she has a series of sensors around some tree roots where she's trying to see if she can see flow going toward trees as they are using water. And then she made a COMSOL model, a coupled model that incorporated vadostone flow and self potential and tried to match her field data. The match isn't ideal, to be honest, and she does an okay job, but these models that we're making don't incorporate the physiology of trees. And so they're simply making trees into basic little pumps, and that's not how they operate. And so we're getting toward something, but these idea of making these complex models that incorporate plants in an organic and holistic way, having tree and plant physiologists working with the physical scientists to try to make these models better is something we clearly need to do. And is a struggle for us, and I'm sure a struggle for some other people that are working on it. So again, plenty to think about here. The geophysical signatures of roots, can we see them? What about root exudates? So the idea of what is coming back out of these plants in terms of how they change the geochemistry around their roots, can we see that? Things with associated mycorrhizal fungi, I don't even know what we can see with that, but I think there's some interesting questions that certainly should be asked. We have questions about how species dependent our results are. And how do we scale up? A lot of the work on trees and plants with geophysics to date has been pretty small, but can we start thinking about hill slope scale, watershed scale measurements? This idea of imaging what some have called the wood wide web, how do these things connect? And then how do we take these data and put them into large scale models in meaningful ways? And I think all of these things are still struggles, and there's a lot of cool questions around trees and plants, and I know that you have some fantastic faculty there working on some of these problems as well. Okay, so getting towards the end here, let's talk about controls on terrestrial carbon. So we obviously need to know what is happening within the subsurface carbon system to think about a changing climate. And there's some things that geophysics can do, right? We could image gases in the subsurface, and we can also probably image some of the structural constraints on carbon stores and transport. This is certainly a little farther away from my own work, but I wanted to bring it up because I thought it might be interesting to this group. Here again is a slightly older paper. This is some work of Andy Parsekian up in the north of Minnesota. And what he's looking at here is ground penetrating radar data that has been converted to gas content through a rock physics relationship. And what he's noticing is that there's differences in this free phase biogenic carbon dioxide and methane across this peatland. This is measured with a common midpoint survey for those of you interested. And what he's finding is that there's really high gas content below the woody layers where the vegetation is forested. So much higher gas content underneath the forest. And then the lawn areas, say for here, generally have much lower gas content. And then there's a fen over here, a groundwater fed wetland that shows the lowest gas content. And so one of the things that's really interesting about this data set is being able to use it to predict the role, in this case of northern peatlands, as they start to release gases under a changing climate. These gases may make up something like 10% of the global methane flux, these northern peatlands. So we can use geophysics to maybe think about how much gas is there and what that might mean as these systems start to thaw. Here's another data set that was looking at the prediction of carbon stocks in wetlands. It was on the cover of JGR Biogeosciences here. And what they were trying to do was build a relationship between carbon stocks and wetland surface area. If they could build a relationship between these two things, this is from the southeast of Florida. If they could build relationships between these, then we could potentially use that relationship in other places that have depressional wetlands to really quickly estimate carbon stocks just by measuring surface area from aerial images. So not quite geophysics in that it's aerial imagery, but I think the idea is compelling. How do we build these relationships between remote proxies for something in a system that we care about? And then here's some work that Xavi Comas has done in Indonesia, looking at the burning of peats during some of the massive fires in Indonesia in 2015. And what he was trying to do is delineate the extent of the burned peat soils. And here again is a ground penetrating radar record. And here's a map of sort of the EM wave velocity that he estimates along this profile. And he is marking these big lateral changes in electromagnetic wave velocity, which he thinks is related to heterogeneities associated with that burned peat. So he wants to use these post-fire images to look at changes in velocity, to infer changes in the thickness of the peat column. And he was constraining this info with some topographic changes based on some LiDAR data that he had before and after the fire. And so this was some work that, again, trying to get at subsurface characteristics, changes in carbon stocks, and geophysics. So again, I know less about carbon work, so I'd be interested in your feedback. I think there's a lot of questions about what estimates we need for carbon cycle status, to think about dynamics and evolution, and what, if any, data can geophysics provide on things like carbon fate, form, or reactivity? The answer might be none, but I think it's an open question. So in short, to sort of summarize today's talk, I know it was sort of a fly through a lot of work, but I thought it might be cool, especially for students, to see that there's so much work happening right now within critical zone geophysics. And there's a lot of open questions about how to use these data qualitatively or quantitatively to test conceptual models, to look at large scale systems rather than just the small scale systems that geophysicists tend to work on. And we have a lot of needs. So if you are interested in this kind of work, how do we come up with the right rock physics relationships? How do we move to these bigger watersheds type scales? And how do we work across disciplinary boundaries to answer some of these questions? And in my last minute, I will take a moment for a shameless plug. For those of you that are interested in critical zone science, I do have a grant that is trying to support especially early career researchers to get involved in critical zone science. We've done a lot of online meetings and community building and webinars that sort of introduce concepts in critical zone science to folks. So if you are interested, please check it out. We're on Twitter, we're on the interwebs. Please join us. Feel free to contact me if you have questions about it. But we definitely have material that might be of interest to students. We'd love to have you involved in any way that makes sense. And with that, here's a whole long list of papers that I talked about. If this helps you find any of them, I'll leave this up for a second. That is my email address if you have questions. And with that, I will thank you all very much for your time and hanging out with me at the end of your day. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
thank you, Kamini. It's a wonderful talk and demonstrating different applications of geophysics, right from carbon estimates to going to the, in general, the electrical conductivity changes for the different projects. Let me start with one query, and many of our colleagues will join. I know there may be several questions. And my query is from your last slide when you talk on the upscaling of the process. And then what kind of the measurable experiment where we can make the quantification on each, like you talked of the fertilizers, you talked of, so there is a ion change, there is a microbial changes, there are changes in the water storage, there is a change in the water storage of the plant, and what we measure with our specific geophysical tools are the integrated effect. So we need to quantify those components at one place, and sometimes they are integrated over the space as well, because the spatial resolution of our measurements are not so precise when we are doing the upscaling. So these are the some questions which are very general in nature, but I think quite complex. So would you like to speak a little bit on it?
Yeah, that is the I guess what I would call the $1 million question over here, right? That is such a difficult question and something that we as geophysicists fight with in every discipline that we work in. And so I do think this is really hard. There are a few things that I think about. So obviously there's rock physics, but I do find rock physics to be quite difficult, right? Because we make those relationships in the lab and then try to attribute them to changes in the field. But the one advantage we have with sort of critical zone science or these shorter term processes that are happening over, say, seasonal changes is time-lapse data. So I do think that the strength of time-lapse geophysics is incredibly helpful to being able to map changes. And as you said, sometimes it's very hard to parse what those changes are. Is it moisture? Is it temperature? Is it change in fertilizer application? But with some co-located data on some of those things, if we can constrain for, they're very cheap sensors to measure, say, temperature at the subsurface, or if we can measure moisture in some places, maybe we can start to parse out what we see in our geophysical images a bit more quantitatively by having these constraining data and looking at them through time as a way of avoiding some of the complexities that come from these uncertain rock physics relationships. So I think your question is a wonderful one and such a difficult one, because it is the sort of holy grail of being able to use geophysics to estimate these properties. But I do think the idea of co-located measurements and time-lapse geophysics is at least a step towards us being able to figure out what we're looking at.
Thanks. So Tanvi, do you have a way to find out the questions, those who have joined through streaming? And before that, we can have probably the people who have already on MS Teams, if Professor Singha or Professor R.M. Singh, or anyone else. Who...
Can I ask? I'm Ashok Singhvi.
Nice to meet you.
Professor Singh is there. Would you like to ask a question? Okay, he's. My compliments to you for a wonderful lecture. And the lecture was also an education probably for how to make good slides. And also, I also liked your frequent insertion of issues to think. Those slides were very good.
Oh, thank
That's
you.
what I think you have given us enormous food to think, and each of your slides could be a program in India to be taken up. And so one of the things which we need to be worried about, and where I think what are the techniques you have evolved could work, is the effect of canals on the groundwater critical zone processes. So there is a horizontal input of water that comes in and which picks up the salts on the way, and the lands which are fertile become unfertile, and it's happened in Rajasthan very effectively. Can you quantify the amount of salt being picked up through your HRSTT, and which will be a very nice story to talk about? That is one question that I had. Second question is, I didn't really understood how did you do NMR in situ? Because how did you, what was the size of your probe and how did you take the NMR? Because I worked on these things, so I know.
Great questions. Yeah,
a few more questions, but I will not, since the students are there, so I will not ask more. Maybe I'll send you a mail and communicate with you. But these two questions.
Yeah, I would love to follow up because I love both of your questions. The NMR data that was actually collected by Daniela Rempe, so those were not my data, just to be clear on that one. But she used what is the name of the company? They make a downhole NMR called the Javelin. Oh my gosh, what is their name? It'll come to me. But there's a company that makes a downhole sonde that fits within a I'm so sorry to use inches, but a 4-inch hole. And so there is this company has put a lot of work into, what is their name? Gosh, they're in Washington State. They're a little, it's right on the tip of my tongue. I'll come to it, but there are a few companies that have been working on sort of pushing NMR forward because it, as you probably well know, having worked on it, it's been a difficult method for people to use in the field for a very long time.
Yes, that was, I was curious to know, how did you do that?
Yeah, this will come to me, but this company has done a lot of.
Anyway, I have one of your references, so I will follow that up.
Please do.
I'll follow that up.
That company is a great little company, and they've been really putting in a lot of time to maximizing signal to noise on NMR data. I'll think of it in a minute. But your other question about the canals, I think you have just come up with what would be such a cool project, because you certainly could put out your electrical resistivity lines and think about across these canals and think about collecting data in time. Where you know that there are changes happening, and also when there are not changes happening in terms of your moisture and your salt loads. And so I could actually see a really neat paper associated with, you've got this landscape in which there aren't these big changes in moisture, there aren't these big changes in salinity happening for some period of time, and then there's either rainfall or the introduction of water into these canals, and that starts to seep in. You'll see that in electrical resistivity data if you collected through time. You will have some it'll be a little difficult to deconvolve moisture and salinity, but maybe you don't care, or maybe we can use moisture content probes as a way to try to parse what's salinity from moisture. But I think that would be such a neat experiment, because you'd actually be able to see, you'd probably see around each of your little canals that movement of moisture into the subsurface. We've done something sort of similar in stream systems, where we've been working in small streams where we actually introduce salt into the stream so that we can try to image the hyporeic zone of exchange between the surface water and the groundwater. And so we're actively trying to see how big that zone is, but you sort of have this free experiment with those canals. That seems like a super interesting project to me, actually. So I think that you could do something really neat in terms of mapping out those locations where infiltration is happening and where those salts might be.
Yeah, why my interest was that it has a direct implication on the agriculture and the soil fertility in that area.
Yeah,
so I think it's an ideal critical zone study that could be done, and maybe you could guide us or guide Indian colleagues to take it up, and that would be a wonderful experiment to do.
I would love to. Oh, and the name of that company is Vista Clara, VISTACLARA, Vista Clara. They're really neat, and they only do NMR.
I will look at it. I was interested. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. My compliments.
Thank you for your questions. Dr. Pujari.
Yeah. Dr. Pujari, we can take your question. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, so Kamini, my compliments to you for your excellent presentation. And probably you have covered everything that any critical zone scientist looks at. because the most interesting was about the basically roots imaging. And the roots are important because they are the connect between the geosphere and the biosphere. I mean, how it regulates the water. But at the same time, roots probably they may vary from, I mean, few centimeters to probably, I mean, few meters. In most of the cases, I mean, in our critical zone, probably may be restricted to only, I mean, 1 or 2 meters, and maybe lesser. I mean, if we take up small trees. But do you have any experience about a particular geophysical tool being more efficient in detecting the roots? I mean, whether it is GPR or some other tools?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I think the idea of imaging roots themselves, the only instruments that are high enough resolution to maybe do that is ground penetrating radar. I've seen some data that is reasonably compelling where people are able to map large roots. But again, it's because the fine roots do so much of the work. I don't think we have a very good way of seeing those, unfortunately. I've seen, I wish I had shown it. There's a paper that published, I wonder if I can find it while we're talking, but that published this image of what they claimed was tree roots, and you do not see anything in the ground penetrating radar data. We managed to get it published, but I do think it's very hard. It's a hard problem. So I think GPR is our best bet. I've seen some work that was never published where a woman had put a gigahertz antenna, so a very high frequency antenna, around a tree and walked around it in concentric circles in a tree that was isolated from other trees. And she certainly sees a pattern of roots that look like tree roots. The problem is for so many of us working in forested landscapes or in agricultural landscapes, it's a rooting party down there, right? And so being able to sort of parse what's happening and the complexity of the subsurface is hard. But I do think this idea of active rooting depth, where we can sort of map where roots might be doing work by looking at changes in moisture, like that very nice paper from Michigan by Jaya Wickrame, that if we can think about those changes that we know are driven by roots, even though we can't image themselves, is it good enough to know where they're doing work? I think it depends on the question, but that one I think is easier.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question. I'll see if I can find that image because it's really funny.
Dr. Maglik, sir, you can ask the question, please. Sir, unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent talk. My question, in fact, my inquiry is that you have talked about uptake of water by trees, trying to relate with soil moisture. In fact, uptake will depend also on the age of tree and also the species type. So are there any studies trying to parameterize the water intake by different species and the corresponding soil moisture to come up with some kind of empirical relationship between these things?
I think you have just outlined what would be a very neat, large-scale critical zone project. All I know of is people that are doing this, like myself, in isolation, where maybe we're looking at one species and sort of the local soil types to where we are. But every time I've presented any of the tree work that we've done, people always say, oh, but what about this other species? But we don't have access to those trees nearby. We work mostly in evergreens, for instance. So pines and spruce and fir. And there's so many questions about how this might look different for deciduous trees, for instance. And so I don't know anyone that's doing this comprehensively, but boy, would that be a really amazing contribution to the critical zone literature if we could start to make those connections more broadly. I think one of the things...
Yeah, understand the relationship in a broader sense. That might be useful in understanding this critical zone in a much better way. This is what... And another, my inquiry is about, you mentioned about measuring electric conductivity of a tree. How do you do that? Do you measure on a stem?
Yeah, so we did stem conductivity. And so we set up a series of electrodes. We just used a stainless steel nail and put them around the outside of our tree. We removed the bark pretty carefully and then inserted the nail into the xylem. We've been working mostly in ponderosa pines, which have a pretty thick sapwood compared to some other trees. But then what we were imaging is the inside of that tree. So you can very clearly see the sapwood heartwood boundary because of the difference in moisture between them. We haven't quite figured out what to do with those data. I think where they might be the most useful is that when we use sap flow sensors, the sapwood area is a component of how we estimate transpiration rates. And that having an accurate estimate of sapwood area from geophysics might be useful. I still want to do something more with it by thinking about changes through time, but I haven't been able to figure out what I'm looking at some of the time, if I'm honest. But yeah, so we just actually instrumented a tree just like you would instrument the earth, but just using nails. And
probably the voltage,
sorry, go ahead.
Probably the voltage difference is too small. So you need a special kind of measurement instruments to measure these kind of tiny variations.
So we actually have a field scale unit that can turn down the applied voltage a little bit so that we don't. One of the problems that we have using field scale instrumentation, say in the lab, which we also do, is that Ohm's law becomes nonlinear at some point if you inject enough current. The relationship V equals to IR falls apart if there's too much current. I don't quite understand, that's above my electrical knowledge, but so we do have an instrument that can turn down the current a little bit, but we see very meaningful changes in voltage and current in trees. We can actually see it without too much problem. So I do think that there is instrumentation out there. There's also a company called Treetronics that is making ER units specifically for trees that you can just slap onto the side of your tree, right? Yeah, so there are companies that are trying to make instruments that do exactly this. It is possible.
It's really useful information. I think it will be very useful for Indian condition also. Thank you.
Thank you. I did find this image for what it's, if I'm allowed to share my screen for one, oops, that's the wrong thing. I was going to show you this really funny, that's not it. Shoot, let me unshare, stop presenting. I had this slide that I really wanted to show you about imaging roots for the person that asked that question. Let me see if I can show this to you somehow. Try again. Me and Teams is not that good. How do I PowerPoint? Why won't it show me this? Well, maybe I can't show this to you. Oh well, I was going to show you this image, but I can't seem to make Teams show it to you.
Okay, probably I'll get back to you or email and then.
Please do. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Yeah, fine. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So, PC sir, you can ask the question. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kamini. I think that was an awesome presentation, and through various examples, you have shown that geophysics can actually take critical zone studies to a completely different level. And that was very heartening to see with your various examples. But one of the big challenges, what I see, is that while critical zone monitoring is a temporal thing, whereas geophysical mapping is more a spatial thing, where you look for the 3D models. You're quite happy to get a 3D model. But now you're talking of stretching it to the 4th dimension, where you need to have a constant sampling of 3D models, and which is probably not possible with every method, or it's not very easy to have 3D models at very fine time intervals, which will help you to, improve your critical zone monitoring. So that is probably one of the biggest challenges. And in this sequence of geophysical methods, I would like to add the ambient noise correlation, which I'm sure you must have come across, which is also cheap and easy to use. And that can easily provide you 4D models in a very small local scale. I mean, basically, I'm working in seismology and particularly with ambient noise tomography, so I thought I should mention this.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. There are almost no critical zone papers right now on ambient seismic. So I think that you could do all kinds of things right now and get that published, because that is such a useful method, especially in noisy areas. I don't know why we don't do more ambient seismics. I've seen almost nothing on it, and I agree that that would be such a cool method for thinking about these systems. Yeah, I love that you brought that up. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, and also it would be quite simple, because you just need to surround the critical zone region with a few seismometers. Actually, I had suggested this to Professor Muddu Shekhar, who started I think the first critical zone in the country. And he said it sounds like a good idea. We can try it out with just maybe a couple of broadband stations all around and try to see how the parameters, the atmospheric parameters, the moisture, all these things which are being done in a conventional way, whether we can complement this data from the seismic experiment. So that would be very interesting too.
I would love, if you do that, I would love to see your data. What a cool idea. Yeah, that's a great idea.
I'll be in touch with you. Yeah.
Please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Singha. We have a couple of questions from students as well.
Great.
So, yeah, actually, we have an academy here, and almost more than 50 plus students are watching you at a single screen. And they have sent their compliments to you, saying that this is an upcoming new field for us. And few have put questions. So I'll just say, regarding your presentation on tree size and tree measurements with the resistivity. So one of them asked, this tree age and size matters?
Does the age and size matter? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. So trees are so complicated. Per the question of one of your professors, I think age does matter. I think size matters. I think species matters. It may even matter if the tree is on a north or a south facing slope. We do see vegetation differences that track aspect even in some systems. And so I love this idea of building a database almost of how different trees and their subsurface connections respond in sort of these critical zone type studies. But I think there are a lot of variables here. And so I feel almost overwhelmed by the number of questions that we could ask around tree subsurface water use. I think we'll see changes with changing climate even. So even for that same tree, as it gets, it matures and gets older, it's also experiencing a different carbon load in the atmosphere. And so I think I love the idea of this sort of geophysics and trees space. I think there's a lot of open questions we could, ask, but I also think that it's just hard. There's so many variables there. So I love your question. I do think that age matters. Size matters for multiple reasons, one of which is that if your tree is really small, you might also have to think about how to set up the instrumentation in a way that allows you to collect data, because one of the problems we have, we're mostly using electrical resistivity, but there are some folks who are using self-potential, some people using ground penetrating radar, a little bit of induced polarization. I've heard someone think about trying to strap somehow a nuclear magnetic resonance to a tree. I have not seen that work, so I don't know, but for electrical resistivity, a problem we have is that when our electrodes get too close together, for how long they are, it violates the point source approximation in the codes that we use for the inversion. So if we have a little tiny tree, we might need little tiny electrodes, like little tiny pins, and then we might have trouble getting enough contact between the electrode, the pin, and the tree to drive a current. So that would be one other potential problem, is just your contact resistance with small trees. So that would be one other potential complication.
And there is another question. They're asking, did you also measure depths of the fractures? Can that help in differentiating the deep tectonic fractures from those developed due to topographic stress?
Yeah, so one of the problems we've struggled with in a lot of these systems that we've been working in, and you may have the same problems, is getting drill rigs into some of these landscapes. And so around where I live, it's the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And so a lot of our watersheds have really big topographic changes. And so we haven't been able to get a proper drill rig in that could drill, say, tens of meters deep. We have a small drill rig that I own that we've brought in that can drill down to about 10 meters. And so we have drilled shallow wells to 10 meters and looked at fractal orientations within those sort of shallow wells. It would be amazing if we could get a drill rig to look down deeper, but in many of the systems we have, they're systems where there are no roads and really big changes in topography, highly forested landscapes around where I live. So part of our limitation has been being able to get a drill rig into place. But I think that if, for instance, you decide to take these ideas and try them in a local landscape, if you have drill rig access, you might be able to really look at those sort of regional controls in a way that we haven't been able to in many of the sites we've been working at, just because of the inaccessibility. So I think what you're thinking about is perfect. We've been limited by accessibility.
And there is another question from a student. As you discussed about modeling using COMSOL multiphysics, I'm curious about the boundary conditions you inculcated to simulate various parts of critical zone.
Yes, I would have to look at it again, how we did this. I remember we did it as a 2D radial model around the tree, is how we set it up in COMSOL. That paper was published in Hydrologic Processes in 2019. It's on my website. The lead author is Emily Wojtek. And we actually have an image that has the boundary conditions for the flow model and the electrical model. I'm trying to remember if we had transport in that model. But certainly the fluid flow and the electrical flow model was defined. One of the things that was hard about the boundary conditions was also figuring out how to describe the tree, because we aren't simulating roots explicitly. So we ended up using a paper that Jasper Root had published a long time ago that described sort of root water uptake as just a simple sort of physical equation that we applied at one of our boundaries because it was this 2D radial model. And so off the top of my head, I don't remember the details well enough. I don't want to lie to you, but if you can't find that paper, just shoot me an email and I'll send it to you. But I remember we made that figure that very clearly shows infiltration at the top boundary layer so that we could think about rainfall. We have a symmetry boundary layer around the 2D radial piece. I think we had a groundwater table at the bottom. I can't remember the outside boundary condition in terms of, I think it just let flow out, but I could certainly, I'll send that paper to you so that you would have those exact boundary conditions if you wanted to do something similar.
There are so many questions. So
such a great audience. You all are wonderful.
And most of them are from students, so this is good. One of them is asking, what are the prominent challenges we could face while working in critical zone in terms of noise present in data?
Yeah, this is problematic. I think especially as there's not as much work on sort of urban critical zone systems. And I do think that is a really cool area of research. But of course, then we have urban noise associated with it. So much of the critical zone work has been done in forested landscapes where there aren't many humans. I think there's a big need for agricultural critical zones or more of those. So I do think that, humans make noise. Back to the idea of ambient seismic, sometimes noise is a good thing. But for a lot of these electrical measures, when you have overhead power lines, for instance, that can be problematic. We tried collecting data once under an airport flight line, and that was hugely problematic for the seismic. We'd have to stop swinging hammers every time a plane came overhead because the noise from the planes was so notable. There are times when it is noise can be a real issue, but power lines, airplanes, any sort of car traffic, those things can affect certainly your seismic data. Sorry, power lines would be more electrical or electromagnetic. So there are things we have to work around. Yeah, I mean, here in the United States, we have problems with people shooting equipment. So that's a very American problem, I suppose. So there are definitely things that we have to sort of figure out. But usually I think a lot of the systems we have, it's not too bad.
Okay. So one more question. Maybe we can do one or two more questions and then we can respond later on. So
yeah, people can certainly email me too. I'd be more than happy to take questions later.
So maybe this can be just two more questions we can take. that one of them is asking about the grassland and forest land critical role in terms of groundwater.
It's specific to that study, sorry, the one from Michigan, were they asking about that forested versus grassland and the groundwater story associated with that? Yeah, so that data set, I'm pretty sure, I'll have to go back and look at it again, but I'm pretty sure it was mostly a vadose water story. And so I do think there's some really interesting questions about plant water uptake and from what stores in the subsurface. There's been some really nice work out of Switzerland lately looking at trees specifically, but I think also there's similar questions around agriculture about where in the subsurface plants pull water from. I mean, I don't know how excited, not to anthropomorphize a plant, but how excited plants are about pulling water from groundwater systems where their roots are submerged and saturated. I think from an oxygen perspective, sometimes that's problematic. And so it seems like a lot of the work has been more vadose zone related with tree water uptake, but we know that there are times when certain trees, at least, are pulling from deeper groundwater stores. And so I don't have an answer. I don't think that particular paper dealt with the groundwater piece at all, but I know that we've been interested from a tree perspective, and I still am not certain. And again, there might be species differentiation and age and these other things that came up, but I don't know when trees are using groundwater. And so I do think there's some interesting questions about the difference between when we see vadose zone stores being used and when we see groundwater stores being used. And some of that we might be able to image with geophysics better than any other method that might be out there. And so I do think there's some open questions there that could be really interesting to take a look at. So I don't know the answer to your question.
Okay. So, and maybe this can be the last question. How to quantify root zone uptake in semi-arid regions, particularly in groundwater studies?
Yeah, so a couple ways. I don't know if geophysics is the right tool, I'll say that much. I think the ways that people have historically done it that I think are quite interesting is putting sap flow sensors on roots. So that is one way of looking at uptake. The other thing is I have a colleague, Hwada Guan, who's at Flinders University in Australia, who's been making some really interesting measurements using psychrometers. So we've been trying to use those lately that basically measures the change in pressure within a root or a stem. And so you can put these psychrometers in multiple places on a tree or a root and see the directionality of flow. So I think that for root uptake specifically, sap flows and psychrometers might be better than geophysics, just because I don't think we have the resolution with the geophysics on a lot of the root problems that are out there. Of course, digging down to roots and clearing them off so that you can put instrumentation on roots is a lot of work too. But I think right now, as far as I know, that's probably our best bet.
Yeah, that's really nice. Sir, can we?
No, I understand still there are 35 questions and I'm sure it cannot be answered. They cannot be answered, and so I request particularly you get them compiled and sent to Professor Singha, and I'm sure she will oblige us answering questions for the students. So kindly propose the formal vote of thanks.
Yes, sir. Well, for saying the formal vote of thanks, I have to repeat words of Dr. Singha itself. She has mentioned that in geoscience have some well-reported issues with diversity, inclusion, and access. And it's the great time to get into the earth and environmental sciences. And there is no shortage of problems. Only we need smart people with diverse thought process to tackle these issues. And today, by your talk, I'm sure that you have justified this statement, and the students who were watching, and we also, the research community here. So we are really excited to see the diversity of geophysics, right from the top of the tree to the root zone and then reaching to the water table. I really thank you, Professor Singha, for your wonderful talk. And I must mention that you have accepted our request to give this talk at 5:30 early morning. And it is this gesture itself shows your love for the subject. And I'm very sure that by your talk today, you took us to the journey of delivering water into the subsurface, then how the transformation of rock to the soil, then finding the linkages between vegetation, green belt, and the hydrology, and the different parameters which are controlling the terrestrial carbon are really worth thought-provoking. So this message has been conveyed that hydrogeophysics is an integral part of the critical zone science. It's just not for the exploration and management. So I'm really grateful to you, and on behalf of our director, we owe a gratitude towards you, and maybe much more conversation and exchange of talk should come in future. I'm thankful to our director, Dr. Tiwari, because he has been always motivating his team to go for innovation and to take up challenges. And by hosting you today in the talk, it has really opened up new opportunities of research in such a challenging field. There has been many students who are watching, so maybe few may be really excited to take this as a challenge. And I thank our esteemed RC members, Professor Singhvi and Professor Singh, and all the senior researchers who have joined us today for this topic. And sir, your presence is highly inspiring to all of us, and especially to the young researchers. We are thankful to you for your time. And also there has been many seniors from the country at different platforms at YouTube who have been watching from universities as well as institutes. And those audience who are really listening and participating in the talks and discussion. So they should be thanked a lot. And finally, I have to thank Dr. Patro, Aditya, Sakib and Nasif from SEG chapter of NGRI for arranging this wonderful talk for the students. And it's really a gratitude, and we should see that this may build up to the network which you have proposed. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you all. You are really my very favorite audience online that I have ever had. So what a great interactive group. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions.